The pounding on my door shook me out of sleep. I rolled over, glanced at the clock, and blinked hard. 6 a.m. The world outside was still wrapped in the gray-blue light of dawn, streets hushed under the Cleveland chill. No one in their right mind would come hammering on a door at this hour unless it was some kind of emergency. My first thought, trained by years of working as a nurse, was that something had happened to a patient, or maybe one of my neighbors had fallen ill? I stumbled out of bed, heart racing, and hurried toward the front door. The pounding came again, heavy and impatient. I called out, "Hold on!" But the noise didn't stop. My hand tightened on the knob as if I was bracing myself for bad news. I swung the door open, the cold morning air rushing in like a slap, and my breath caught in my throat. There stood my brother, Corvin, with 2 battered suitcases at his feet. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with something more dangerous: entitlement. He didn't ask, he didn't greet me. He simply pushed his words at me like a verdict. "Move out, it's mine now." I stared at him, my mouth slightly open, trying to gather air, trying to gather sense. For a moment, I was caught between shock and disbelief, wondering if maybe I was still half asleep and dreaming. The silence inside me was louder than his voice. "Corvin," I managed finally. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer. He picked up one of his bags and brushed past me, his shoulder pressing into mine as if I were the intruder. He dropped the suitcase on my couch, the same couch I saved up months of overtime to buy, the one I had chosen after testing a dozen others in the store. I closed the door slowly, my hands trembling. "You can't just barge in. I live here. I rent this place from Mom and Dad." "Not anymore," he said, tossing his second bag onto the armchair, knocking one of my neatly stacked nursing journals to the floor. "They already know I'm moving in. You should start packing." I could feel heat rising in my chest. "You don't live here, Corvin. I do. I pay the rent. Every month. On time." He smirked, his voice casual, like someone ordering breakfast. And I said, "Not anymore. This is happening. Stop fighting it." Inside me, a knot twisted. It wasn't just that he'd invaded my space. It was the way he dismissed my words, as though everything I had built here was nothing more than temporary clutter waiting for him to claim. Before I could push the argument further, my phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up, desperate for some sense, praying maybe this was all a mistake. The screen lit up with my mother's name. I pressed answer. "Mom, you need to tell him to leave. He's in my apartment. He's—" Her voice cut through, sharp but calm, as if she had been rehearsing. "Thalassa, you should be grateful we even let you rent that place. Don't forget whose name is on the deed." Her words landed heavier than Corvin's suitcases. My pulse drummed in my ears. "Grateful?" I whispered. "I've been paying for years, every month, fixing things, repainting, making it livable." "Family needs to help family," she said. "Your brother has nowhere else to go. You've had enough time there. Be thankful we gave you that space as long as we did." I stood frozen, phone pressed against my ear, eyes locked on Corvin as he flipped through my mail like it was his own. Gratitude. That was the word she used. Gratitude for turning my independence into a loan I never asked for. Gratitude for living in a place I paid for but apparently never truly owned. I remembered a quote one of my patients once shared during a hard conversation. "Boundaries are not a sign of disrespect. They are a sign of self-respect." Brené Brown had said that, and it had stayed with me because it was true. But in this family, boundaries were rewritten as selfishness, self-respect, as betrayal. All these years, I thought, all these years of being reliable, of fixing the leaks, of painting the walls, of carrying the rent, and now I'm told it was just a favor? I hung up without saying goodbye. The room felt colder. I glanced around at everything I had worked for. The new curtains I had picked because the morning light softened against them, the rug I'd chosen for its warmth underfoot after long shifts, the shelves I had assembled piece by piece until my hands blistered. Every corner whispered of my effort, my independence. I had chosen this apartment for a reason. It was the first time I had stood on my own 2 feet, the first time I proved to myself that I didn't need anyone's permission to build a life. I remembered my double shifts at the hospital, the exhaustion in my bones, and how I saved just enough to make rent and still keep this place alive. This wasn't just a roof, I thought. It was proof I wasn't dependent on anyone. And yet Corvin had spent years drifting. Unemployed, one scheme after another, always cushioned by my parents' excuses. He's just struggling, they would say. He'll get back on his feet. They spoke of his future as if it was a golden promise, while mine was treated as mundane fact, steady but invisible. Maybe they never saw me at all. Maybe they only ever saw him, the one with potential, while I was the one who simply kept things afloat. Bitterness seeped into my veins, but with it, something else, the faint spark of defiance. I turned back to the present, and there he was, Corvin sprawled on my couch, his shoes kicked off, his posture one of triumph. He leaned back as if he'd conquered a kingdom. His smirk widened. "You should pack up soon," he muttered lazily. "I'm having friends over later this week." My heart pounded against my ribs. Outrage burned hot, fear coiled in my stomach, disbelief clouded my breath. In that moment, clarity cut through me like glass. This wasn't about money, it wasn't about rent, it was about erasing me from my own life, rewriting the story I had built. And I realized my fight wasn't with Corvin alone, it was with my own blood. The hours after Corvin barged into my apartment felt unreal, like a bad play I couldn't step out of. He had made himself comfortable without hesitation, his muddy boots sinking into the rug I bought on sale after months of saving, his suitcases blocking the hallway like barricades. Every detail screamed violation. This was no longer my sanctuary, but a stage for his triumph. I walked around, picking up one of my fallen nursing journals, and felt as though someone had peeled the skin from my life and was wearing it as their own. I reached for my phone, my hands stiff, and texted my parents. "Corvin just moved into my place. He says you agreed. Is this true?" I watched the 3 dots of their reply blink too quickly for comfort. "Come over this morning. We need to talk." No denial, no outrage, just cold arrangement. A chill passed through me, stronger than the draft from the front door. For one brief second, I let myself hope. Maybe they wanted to settle this properly. Maybe they'd tell him to back off. The suspense gnawed at me as I got dressed, each motion heavy, like pulling on armor. As I drove across town, Cleveland's winter sky hung gray over the houses, my breath fogging the windshield, my chest a drum of dread. The kitchen in my parents' house smelled faintly of reheated coffee. I sat at the table, my hands folded, waiting for a reason. Evadne entered first, her cardigan pulled tight, her lips set in a line that already told me what she was about to say. "You're the youngest," she began without greeting. "You've had enough time in that place. Now it's your brother's turn." I blinked, the words hitting me like stones. "Enough time. I've lived there because I pay for it. Every bill, every repair, every ounce of work to keep it standing." "How can you say it's his turn like it's a game?" She adjusted her glasses and shook her head as if speaking to a child. "Fair doesn't always mean equal. Families share. You've had your season. Now it's Corvin's." "Fair should mean earned," I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. "I worked double shifts to pay on time. I fixed the plumbing when it broke. I repainted those walls myself. What exactly did he earn?" Her tone softened but carried poison underneath. "A woman doesn't need so much space anyway. You'll understand one day." My jaw clenched. Sexism disguised as practicality, an insult wrapped in care. I had walked into this kitchen searching for fairness, and instead I found a script already written. One where I was reduced to someone temporary, expendable. Osric entered then, his steps slow but firm, the smell of engine oil still clinging to his jacket even after years of retirement. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority was quieter, more dangerous. "Corvin was once the pride of this family," he said, leaning against the counter. "He still has potential. He could have been somebody if life hadn't knocked him down." "And me?" I asked, daring him to meet my eyes. "You're steady," he said simply, dismissively. "You pay bills. You keep things going. But you were never the dreamer. He's the one who can rise again." The sting of those words cut deeper than shouting ever could. I was the invisible labor, the background hum, the one who held everything together while they pinned their hopes on his wasted promises. I thought bitterly, in this country, we worship the dreamers, even when they never wake up. But the ones who build, who sustain, we call them ordinary. Their gaze told me I was the scaffolding, never the structure. I inhaled slowly, forcing myself not to break. Instead of exploding, I chose my weapons, questions sharp enough to slice. Who fixed the pipes last winter when they burst? I asked evenly. Silence. Evadne's fingers tightened on her mug. Who paid the property taxes when the notice came, and you said you were short? Osric shifted, his eyes avoiding mine. And who, I leaned forward, kept that apartment from falling apart while Corvin drifted from job to job? You're making too much of this, Evadne snapped, her voice tightening. That's what family does. It's expected. Expected doesn't mean invisible, I replied. Invisible labor is still labor. It just doesn't get applause. The air thickened between us. My tone had shifted. Not pleading, not begging, but firm. And the more I spoke, the more defensive they became, as though my truth was an act of rebellion. For the first time, I realized strength wasn't in silence, but in marking hypocrisy out loud. The conversation closed like a slammed door. Evadne placed her mug down with finality. Your brother needs this more than you do. Family sacrifices for family. Osric nodded in agreement, his voice gravelly. He'll get back on his feet. You'll understand one day. I stood, my chair scraping the linoleum floor, their eyes fixed on me as though waiting for surrender. But I didn't cry, and I didn't yield. I turned, walked past the hallway photographs where Corvin's face seemed to shine brighter than mine, and pushed out into the cold air. Anger, betrayal, and something sharper churned inside me. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I drove away, each block of road a rope tightening around me. For years, I had believed I was the one holding this family together. But as the morning stretched into noon, the truth pressed harder. Maybe I wasn't the anchor at all. Maybe I was just the rope they tied tighter and tighter until there was no air left in me. And I saw it clearly. They weren't asking me to help. They were asking me to disappear. The house felt different the moment I walked back in after Corvin's sudden takeover. My apartment wasn't a home that morning. It was a stage where I no longer belonged. He had sprawled out with his bags blocking the hallway like barricades, and his boots left streaks of mud across the rug I'd carefully cleaned the night before. I caught sight of one of my nursing journals half buried under his suitcase, and the thought came to me like a whisper I couldn't shake. It felt like a stranger had slipped into my skin and claimed it as his own. I picked up my phone and typed out a message to my parents. Corvin just barged into my place. He says you agreed to this. Is that true? My fingers hovered for a moment before I pressed send. I stood by the counter staring at the screen, waiting for clarity, hoping against everything that they would respond with outrage, that they'd tell him to leave immediately. The reply came quickly. Come to the house this morning. We need to talk. I sat with that line, the cold air from the cracked window creeping up my spine. They hadn't denied it. They hadn't even asked if I was okay. Just a summons. I dressed slowly, my clothes feeling heavier than usual, as though every button, every sleeve was a piece of armor I wasn't sure I could wear right. By the time I got into the car and pulled onto the quiet Cleveland streets, the winter sky had settled into a dull gray. Houses passed by in neat rows, but the roads felt longer than ever. I gripped the wheel tightly, my breath fogging the windshield, a silent prayer building inside me. Maybe there was still a chance they'd see reason. Maybe they'd take my side. The kitchen smelled faintly of old coffee, the kind that had been reheated too many times. I sat at the table, hands folded, the ticking of the clock loud in the silence. My mother, Evadne, came in, her cardigan pulled tight around her, her face calm, but her eyes hard. You're the youngest, she began, no greeting, no question. You've had enough time in that place, now it's your brother's turn. I blinked. Enough time? Mom, I live there because I pay for it. Every month. On time. I keep it standing. How can you say it's his turn as if we're taking shifts on a ride? Her lips pressed thin. Fair doesn't always mean equal. Families share. You've had your season. Now it's Corvin's. Fair should mean earned, I countered, my voice sharper than I intended. I've worked double shifts, skipped meals, carried rent and repairs while he sat idle. What did he earn? Her tone softened, but carried steel beneath. A woman doesn't need so much space anyway. You'll understand one day. The words fell heavy, sexism coated in practicality. I sat there, staring at the mug in her hands, realizing that no matter what I said, I had already been cast in the role of temporary occupant. My father, Osric, stepped in a few minutes later. The faint smell of grease still clung to his jacket, though he had retired from the garage years ago. His voice was steady, not loud, but each word dropped like a stone. Corvin was once the pride of this family, he said, leaning against the counter. He still has potential. He could have been somebody. And me? I asked, forcing him to look at me. He exhaled. You're steady. You pay bills. You keep things going. But you were never the dreamer. He's the one who can rise again. The sting of his dismissal hit harder than if he had shouted. I wasn't the one with possibility. I was the one who kept the lights on. I thought bitterly, in this country we worship the dreamer, even when he never wakes up. But the one who builds, the one who sustains, we call ordinary. And that's what I was to them. Ordinary scaffolding propping up their hopes for him. I forced myself to stay calm, though the fire was hot inside me. I didn't raise my voice. I asked questions sharp enough to pierce the air. Who fixed the pipes last winter when they burst? Evadne's fingers tightened on her mug. She didn't answer. Who paid the property taxes when the notice came, and you said you were short? Osric shifted his stance, his gaze drifting to the floor. And who? I leaned forward, my voice steady. Kept that apartment livable while Corvin drifted from job to job? You're making too much of this, my mother snapped. That's what family does. It's expected. Expected doesn't mean invisible, I said. Invisible labor is still labor. It just doesn't get applause. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. My tone had shifted. I wasn't pleading anymore. I wasn't asking them to see me. I was pointing out their hypocrisy, and the more I spoke, the more defensive they became, as though truth itself was rebellion. At last, Evadne set her mug down firmly. Your brother needs this more than you do. Family sacrifices for family. Osric nodded in agreement. He'll get back on his feet. You'll understand one day. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping the linoleum floor. Their eyes followed me, waiting for my surrender, maybe expecting tears, but none came. I turned, walked past the hallway lined with photographs, so many of Corvin, his smiles captured like trophies, while mine were fewer, smaller, tucked in the corners. The air outside hit me colder than it had all morning, but sharper too, as if it cut through the haze. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I drove, not from weakness, but from fury. For years, I had believed I was the rope holding us together, the one binding a fragile family into place. But the truth pressed down harder with every mile. I wasn't their anchor. I was the rope they tied tighter and tighter until there was no room for me to breathe. And as the road stretched ahead, I knew this much. They weren't asking me to help. They were asking me to disappear. When I returned to my apartment that evening, the air inside felt different, heavier. The front door opened to a sight that turned my stomach. Corvin wasn't just lounging around anymore. He was pacing from wall to wall, holding a measuring tape, stretching it across the living room, as though he were a contractor hired to redesign. He hummed to himself while jotting numbers on the back of my mail, the bills I had worked long hours to cover. This room will be my office, he said without even turning around. Maybe I'll repaint. Something lighter. Blue, maybe. I stood frozen in the doorway, grocery bag slipping from my hand onto the floor. The sound of apples rolling across the wood barely made him pause. You don't live here, Corvin, I said, my voice clipped, sharp. You don't decide anything. Not the color, not the furniture, not a single wall. He chuckled, pulling the tape across the window frame. You're so tense. It's already decided. Mom and Dad told me this place is mine. Why fight what's inevitable? The words landed like a punch, each one driving out what little breath I had left. Inside, my thoughts twisted. It was like watching a stranger map out my body, pointing at pieces of me as if choosing organs to claim. Shock fused with anger, each second quickening the beat in my chest. I dropped my purse on the counter and marched toward him, planting myself firmly in his path. Enough. If you don't stop this, if you don't put down that tape, I won't stay silent anymore. He tilted his head, smirk spreading like oil. You? What are you going to do? Run crying to mom and dad again? His tone stung, but something sharper cut through. For years I had avoided confrontation, choosing peace over fire. But now the humiliation I felt was different. It wasn't just about him tossing his weight around. It was about occupation. This wasn't a sibling squabble. It was a hostile takeover. I'm warning you, Corvin, I said, holding his gaze steady. This is not your home. You can pretend all you want, but don't think I'll just disappear quietly. His laugh echoed, filling the space like smoke. Disappearing quietly is exactly what you do best. I clenched my fists at my sides, forcing myself not to scream. Rage burned beneath my skin, but I knew anger alone wouldn't win. He thrived on it, fed on it. I would have to be sharper than that. The sound of heavy boots against the hallway broke the tension. The door swung open without a knock, and Osric stepped inside. My father. His presence was solid, commanding, the kind that filled a room even before he spoke. Good job looking ahead, he said, clapping Corvin on the back. This place should have been yours anyway. I stared at him, my chest hollowing. Dad, are you serious? You're standing in my apartment. I've paid every dime, fixed every pipe, bought every stick of furniture. He cut me off with a laugh that rattled through me like glass shattering. We only let you stay because no one else wanted it. Don't act like you've done us a favor. His words knocked me sideways, a gut punch that left me breathless. I looked at the chair he lowered himself into, my chair, the one I had chosen after endless hours shopping, and saw him sit as if he were judge and executioner. Something in me broke and hardened all at once. Their laughter wasn't just sound. It was a weapon, a reminder that they didn't see me, never had. I remembered a line I had once read. The most painful thing is losing yourself in the process of loving too much. Marilyn Monroe's voice echoed in my memory. I had given too much, money, labor, time, even silence. And here they were, turning it into dust. I stood still, but inside, the turning point had come. This warning I had given Corvin wasn't just for him, it was for me. If I kept quiet now, I would lose myself completely. Their laughter painted years of smaller humiliations in brighter color. Being asked to sit at the folding chair near the kitchen during family dinners, while Corvin took the seat of honor. Watching him lauded for half-baked ideas, while my steady paycheck and repairs were dismissed as just what you're supposed to do. Each memory fit together like tiles on the same floor, leading here to this moment. They think I'll bow my head and vanish, I thought, a coldness settling in my chest. They think my silence means surrender. They don't know I've already started planning. The pain was sharp, but sharper still was the resolve growing behind it. I would not crumble, not this time. When Corvin finally pocketed the tape measure and Osric leaned back in satisfaction, they looked like men who had already won. Corvin's smug grin carried the triumph of conquest. Osric's nod was one of approval, a father pleased with his heir. I sat down, my fists tight against my knees, but not a single tear fell. My silence stretched not as weakness, but as decision. I thought quietly to myself, I used to believe silence meant weakness. Tonight, I learned silence could be strategy. And if they wanted a war of erasure, I was ready to fight it my way. That night, after my father and Corvin had left my apartment, I sat alone at the edge of my bed, staring at the grooves their boots had pressed into my rug. Osric's mocking laugh replayed in my head, a sound so sharp it seemed to linger in the air long after they were gone. We only let you stay because no one else wanted it. The sentence spun inside me like a nail drilled into bone, and Corvin's smug face, The way he paraded around with that tape measure, he had already claimed victory before the battle even began. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself. I had been erased while sitting in my own living room. That thought cut deeper than anything else. To be stripped of ownership while still inside the walls I had built felt like a theft not of space, but of self. Yet, the more I turned it over in my mind, the more something steadier grew. They might want to reduce me to silence, to compliance, but I wouldn't hand them that satisfaction. My dignity was mine to protect, and if I had to fight, I would do it on my terms. The idea formed slowly, like a seed splitting open in the dark. I couldn't react emotionally. I had to be strategic. By morning, my phone rang. Evadne's voice came first, brittle and clipped, followed by Osric's gruff bass in the background. "You're being selfish," she said, wasting no time. "You won't even share with your brother. After all he's been through, you can't give him this one thing?" I tightened my grip on the phone. "Selfish?" I repeated, my voice trembling with restrained rage. "I paid for every plate in that cupboard, every fork in the drawer. I kept this place alive when no one else cared." Osric cut in, dismissive and cold. "Family sacrifices. You're making it harder than it should be. Stop acting like a victim." His words hit me differently this time. They weren't just defending Corvin, they were rewriting the story, flipping me into the villain. The victim had become the problem. The problem had become the one they protected. Inside, a bitter thought formed. Selfish. Selfish is standing on someone else's work and calling it your throne. I thought about something I had read years ago, a line that surfaced now like a buoy. When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. That was Corvin in one sentence, and my parents had fallen into his shadow, mistaking his demands for fairness. I took a deep breath, pressing the phone to my ear, and spoke evenly. Selfish is demanding my work and calling it yours. Selfish is erasing the person who actually kept the lights on while you pretended the house ran itself. Silence crackled on the line. Evadne exhaled sharply. "Don't twist this, Thalassa. You're overreacting." "No," I said firmly. "I'm done reacting. I'm stating facts." Osric's tone grew harsher. "Watch your mouth. You're being disrespectful." "Respect," I said quietly, "is a two-way street. And I haven't seen it from you in years." The call ended abruptly, the click loud in my ear. For a moment, anger boiled hot, but beneath it something else surprised me. Relief. I wasn't begging anymore. I wasn't pleading to be seen. I had drawn the line with words, and though they were furious, I felt taller than I had in days. That night, after hours at the hospital, I returned home and began the first step of my plan. I didn't make an announcement, didn't tell a soul. I simply started reclaiming what was mine. The picture frames from the living room wall came down one by one. I wrapped each in newspaper and slid them carefully into a box. The kitchen was next. The dishes I had bought at a thrift store during my first year living here, the mugs I had collected from hospital fundraisers, even the battered frying pan that had seen 100 lonely dinners. Each item I carried down to my car felt like a piece of myself being pulled out of their grasp. They wanted me gone. So I began disappearing, but not the way they imagined. They thought I would vanish in defeat. Instead, I was reclaiming piece by piece, weaving an exit on my terms. I placed the first box gently in the trunk, closed it softly, and looked up at the apartment windows glowing against the night. For the first time, the space didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a shell I was peeling away, revealing something stronger beneath. They wanted me erased, I thought, standing in the chill. But each thing I take with me proves I was here. Every nail I hammered, every curtain I hung, every receipt with my name. They can't undo that. The silence of the street wrapped around me, not heavy, but protective. I moved slowly, carefully, making sure no one noticed. My strength wasn't in announcing, it was in planning. When I finally sat on the edge of my bed that night, a single box already waiting in the trunk of my car, I let out a long breath. My fists unclenched, my body eased, but my resolve hardened. "They thought they had cornered me," I whispered to the dark. What they didn't see was that every night, I was unlocking my way out. The room was quiet, but in that quiet, I found power. And soon, I knew, they would open the door to a home stripped of every lie they'd built. 2 days later, after another grueling shift at the hospital, I carried my bag up the steps and turned the key in the lock, already exhausted. I expected the silence of my apartment to greet me, the kind of silence that could let me finally breathe. But as the door swung open, voices tumbled out instead. Familiar, invasive, wrong. There they were. Corvin lounged in the middle of the room, my parents seated comfortably as though it were their living room, not mine. And in Corvin's hand, raised like a trophy, was my journal. Not the kind with work notes or shopping lists, but the private one I kept in my desk drawer, lists of expenses, frustrations, the inner workings of my mind when the weight of everything pressed too hard. "Listen to this," Corvin crowed, flipping through pages with exaggerated flair. "She actually wrote down expenses like she's running a hotel." Evadne smirked as if it were the most amusing thing she'd heard all week. Osric chuckled, low and dismissive. My chest tightened, my pulse thundering in my ears. This wasn't just invasion anymore, it was exposure. My private words had become their entertainment, my life reduced to a punchline. I dropped my bag to the floor. "Put that down," I snapped, my voice sharper than I'd planned. "That isn't yours to touch." Corvin's grin widened. "What's the big deal? Afraid someone might see what you really think?" I marched across the room, snatched the journal out of his hands, and hugged it to my chest. My breath came fast, but my voice was steady. "This is mine. You had no right." "You're too secretive," Evadne said, leaning back in her chair as though she owned the space. "Always hiding things. Maybe if you weren't so paranoid, there wouldn't be anything to laugh at." Osric joined in, his voice heavy with mock authority. "Families don't need walls of secrecy. If you're embarrassed, maybe that says more about you than about us." I could feel my hands trembling against the leather cover, but I didn't back down. "Privacy isn't secrecy," I said, my voice cutting the air. "Boundaries aren't betrayal." They didn't flinch. Corvin rolled his eyes, Evadne smirked again, and Osric chuckled as if my words were the tantrum of a child. But I pressed on, louder this time. "The right to privacy is the hallmark of freedom. And you," I swept my gaze across all three, "you've trampled it without a thought." For the first time, silence followed. A heavy pause, the kind that shows even bullies recognize when a line has been drawn. Humiliation still burned in my cheeks, but under it came something stronger, anger reshaping itself into resilience. A voice broke the stillness, one I hadn't expected. Sitting on the couch, beer bottle in hand, was one of Corvin's friends, a woman named Zerelda, I'd met only once before. She raised her eyebrows and blurted out, "Wait a second, isn't this technically her place? Everyone knows she's the one paying for it." The words dropped like a stone in water, rippling across the room. My chest lifted at the shock of hearing truth from someone outside the family. For a heartbeat, I felt seen. But Evadne was quick to snap back, her voice sharp with control. "You don't understand family business. This isn't your concern." Corvin tried to laugh it off, waving his hand as though brushing crumbs from a table. "She pays rent, sure, but it's family property. She just happens to live here. Big difference." I stared at him, my grip on the journal so tight my knuckles whitened. It took a stranger to say what they never could, I thought bitterly, that this place was mine, that I mattered. For a brief second, I allowed myself to savor that small validation, bittersweet, fleeting, but real. The pause didn't last. Instead of acknowledging the truth spoken aloud, my parents doubled down. "You're being dramatic," Osric said, his tone dismissive, his arms folded across his chest. "Even outsiders can see it." Corvin leaned forward, his voice raised, almost shouting. "See? Even my friends know. You're just the tenant, not the owner. You don't get it. This place was always meant for me." The words hit me hard, but I steadied my voice. I locked eyes with him, then turned to both of my parents. "If you're going to erase me, at least admit you're doing it. Say it out loud, so you can hear how cruel it sounds." The room fell quiet, just for a beat. The tension was thick, pressing down on every corner of the apartment. No one answered, not with words. But their silence was enough. It was the truth they refused to say, the truth I already knew. Humiliation twisted inside me, but alongside it came clarity. They would never give me recognition, not willingly, and I had to stop waiting for it. Without another word, I pulled the journal tighter against me and walked to the door. My chest rose and fell with quick, angry breaths. I didn't look back at their faces. I didn't need to. Out in the hallway, the air was cooler, sharper. I pressed the journal to my chest and felt my heartbeat pounding against it like a drum. If they wanted to laugh at me, fine, I whispered to myself. But laughter was all they had left. I still had my plan. I stepped out into the night, my steps firmer with every stride down the stairwell, and every insult they threw only made my silence sharper. It was late Friday afternoon when I came home to find an envelope slipped under my door. At first, I thought it was just junk mail or some neighborhood notice, but the heavy paper and official letterhead stopped me cold. I picked it up, slid my finger under the flap, and pulled out the document. It was a lease amendment, formal, typed neatly with every line boxed in, every number printed sharp enough to cut, and at the bottom, signed in two familiar hands, my parents'. The words blurred for a second as my chest tightened. My rent was doubled. Not raised, not adjusted, doubled. I heard my father's voice echoing from days earlier. This is for the good of the family. The letter trembled in my hands. I set it on the counter, staring at it as though it might catch fire. They hadn't just taken sides, they had pulled out every nail holding me in place. Inside, the realization formed hard and fast. They didn't want me to stay. They wanted to make staying impossible so that leaving would look like surrender. This wasn't about fairness. It was coordinated sabotage, signed and sealed by the people who raised me. I thought of an old saying I'd once heard. Follow the money, and you'll find the truth. And the truth was this. Money was their weapon, and I was their target. I called immediately. My hands shook, but my voice was steady when Evadne picked up. What is this? I demanded. You doubled my rent? You signed this? Her voice was cold, measured. It's only fair, Thalassa. Corvin will be moving in, and extra expenses need to be covered. Fair? My voice cracked, then steadied. I was already covering everything. Every utility, every repair, every tax bill you conveniently forgot. You're just calling theft another word. Family duty. Osric's voice came over the line, low and gravelly. Don't be dramatic. Family sacrifices. You're making this harder than it should be. I gripped the phone tighter. No, you're making it harder. You're rewriting the story. I've carried this apartment for years, and now you hand it to him like a prize. That's not sacrifice. That's betrayal. Their silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then Evadne said flatly, If you can't handle this, maybe you should find somewhere else. I ended the call without another word. My anger was sharp, but underneath was something colder, clearer. Negotiation was useless. They had made their choice, and now I had to make mine. 3 days later, the next blow landed. I came home to find a glossy flyer waiting on my doormat. At first glance, I thought it was some community event or a neighbor's yard sale, but when I picked it up, the headline caught my breath. Housewarming party, hosted by Corvin, and under it in bold letters, location, my address. My name was nowhere on it, not a footnote, not even a trace. I stood in the hallway staring at that glossy sheet, my keys still in my hand, the apartment door unopened behind me. I had thought humiliation couldn't cut deeper, but here it was, printed in ink for the world to see. Inside my mind, his voice filled the silence. Finally, I've got my own place. This wasn't just about space anymore. It wasn't even about money. It was about erasing me from my own story and replacing it with his. My existence reduced to a temporary placeholder so he could step in and call it his victory. The paper crinkled in my fist as I squeezed it tight. I didn't even realize I was shaking until I dropped my keys on the floor. That night, I sat at the table with the flyer spread out in front of me. I stared at the bold letters as if they were daring me to fold. The cruelty of it all settled into me. The journal humiliation, the doubled rent, now this party invitation, each one a calculated strike meant to push me to the edge. But instead of breaking me, it was shaping me. They were counting on me breaking, I whispered into the empty room. But I wasn't breaking, I was bending into strategy. I thought of an old saying, one passed down in whispers at the hospital when nurses vented about injustice. Revenge is a dish best served cold. Cold. That's how I would play it. Not loud, not desperate, but calculated, patient, exact. I began outlining my next moves in silence. The boxes I had already started filling sat by the door, each one a piece of my life reclaimed. They thought compliance was inevitable, but I had already stepped outside their script. I walked to the fridge, smoothed the flyer flat, and placed it under a magnet. Not as a defeat, but as a reminder. They think this will mark my eviction, I said softly, pressing it into place. But I'll make sure it marks theirs. I stood there for a long moment, staring at those bold words under the kitchen light. Because when that party came, I wasn't planning to be the guest. I was planning to be the storm. By the time I reached my building that evening, laughter spilled out into the hallway before I even touched the door. The sound was sharp, foreign, like an unwelcome band warming up in the wrong house. I pushed the door open slowly, my bag still on my shoulder, and froze. My apartment, my walls, my furniture, my home was flooded with strangers. People I had never seen before were drinking, eating from trays set out on my counters, clinking glasses as if they belonged here. And in the center of it all was Corvin, basking in the glow of attention. He slapped shoulders, raised his cup high, and greeted guests as if he had hosted 100 parties here before. "Welcome to my place," he declared. "Glad you could make it." Neighbors nodded approvingly, and one even commented, "You've got good taste, Corvin. Nice curtains, really makes the room feel warm." I gripped the strap of my bag until my fingers went numb. They were complimenting my decorations, my choices, my hard work, but crediting him. Inside my head, the words pounded. They wanted me erased privately before. Tonight, they wanted me erased publicly. I stepped further in, no one stopping me, but no one acknowledging me either. The humiliation burned, disbelief mingling with anger as I watched them all admire what was never his to give. Then my eyes caught the wall above the couch, where a family photo once hung, a photo of me, Corvin, and our parents. There was a new frame. My stomach dropped. I walked closer, weaving past laughing guests. It wasn't new. It was the same frame, the same picture, except my face had been cut out. In its place was a photo of just Corvin and my parents, smiling together, complete without me. A guest nearby tilted their head. "Where's your sister in this?" Corvin smirked, smug as ever. She was never really part of this home. For a second, the room blurred. The folding chair had been rehearsal. This was opening night. My literal erasure now hung on the wall for everyone to see. I clenched my jaw, steadied my breath, and let the fury settle into something sharper. Instead of lashing out, I walked calmly to the center of the room. Conversations faltered. Some turned to watch. Guests seemed to expect an outburst, a screaming match, but my composure was so steady it startled them. "If you're going to celebrate," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the chatter, "at least celebrate with the truth." Eyes followed as I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder, one I had prepared days ago. I spread the papers out on the coffee table. The lease agreement, signed in my name, page after page of receipts for the furniture, the appliances, even the rug beneath their feet. Silence poured over the room. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered, "She's got proof." Corvin stiffened, then tried to laugh, his voice higher than usual. "She's exaggerating." "It's not like that." But my voice cut through his. "I had been invisible in this house, but tonight, I chose to make your lies transparent." Evadne stepped forward quickly, her hand raised as if to swat the truth out of the air. "Documents don't matter. Family matters. That's what counts." I turned to her, holding her gaze steady. "If family mattered, you wouldn't have erased me from the photo." The murmurs grew louder. Guests exchanged glances, the weight of truth shifting in the room. Corvin's facade was cracking, and they all saw it. Osric tried to salvage it with his usual authority. Enough. This is embarrassing. But the damage was already done. Their guests weren't looking at me with shame. They were looking at him, at them. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, I said, my voice calm but unyielding. And tonight, all of you get to see what's really been festering here. The room erupted with overlapping voices, some defending me, some muttering doubts about Corvin, others whispering shock at the photo, the receipts, the clear evidence of my erasure. For once, the noise wasn't against me. It was on my side. And I stood there, taller than I had felt in years. I walked over to the wall, pulled the frame down, and set it face down on the table. The sound of glass tapping wood echoed louder than the chatter. They wanted me gone from the picture, I thought, my hands steady now. Tonight, I left them with the empty frame instead. The room stilled, guests staring at the bare space on the wall where the photo had hung. I didn't need to say more. The silence itself carried the weight of every erased memory, every betrayal. And as I looked around at their faces, friends, neighbors, strangers, I knew the night had only just begun. The morning after Corvin's so-called party, the apartment felt like the aftermath of a storm. The walls that had once echoed with drunken laughter and careless chatter now groaned in silence. Empty bottles littered the counters, crumbs dotted the rug, and the stale air reeked of cheap beer. But there was something else in that silence, something heavier. Corvin stirred from the couch, his head hanging low, eyes still puffy from a night of celebrating himself. He rubbed his temples, then stood slowly, looking around. His movements grew frantic, his gaze darting from corner to corner. "Where the hell is everything?" His voice cracked, sharper with each word. The couch he sat on was the only one left. The lamps were gone. The kitchen shelves bare. The end tables missing. Even the small rug under the coffee table had vanished. All that remained was the skeleton of a party surrounded by walls that suddenly looked too bare. As if on cue, Evadne and Osric arrived. They stepped in with the air of conquerors, ready to bask in their son's victory. But instead of triumph, they found Corvin pacing like a caged animal. "Where's the furniture?" Evadne demanded. "They were here last night!" Corvin shouted, flailing his arms at the hollow corners. "Everything's gone!" I watched from the doorway, leaning quietly against the frame, the last set of keys dangling from my hand. They came for victory. They found vacancy. Corvin's head whipped toward me. "You! What did you do?" Evadne's face flushed, her voice shaking. "Thalassa, what is this? What happened here?" I stepped forward, calm, measured, my heels clicking against the floor that now amplified every sound. Everything missing. That was mine. The lamps, the rug, the shelves, you name it. I paid for it. I have the receipts to prove it. Corvin's face twisted. "You can't just strip the place." I met his rage with an even voice. "I didn't strip it. I took what was mine." "You're welcome to the lies you paid for." The emptiness of the living room amplified my words. The echoes bounced off bare walls, every syllable louder than any piece of furniture could have been. "What you own ends up owning you," I said, recalling a line I once read by Chuck Palahniuk. "But this?" I swept my arm across the hollow space. "This never owned me. You did." Evadne sputtered, her hands tightening on her coat. "You went too far. This isn't how family treats family." But her protest sounded small in the cavernous room. Osric stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "You can't just take everything," he barked, trying to summon the authority that used to silence me. I looked him in the eye, my voice cold as stone. "I just did. And all you had left was my silence." The line cut through the room like glass. For a moment, even Corvin froze, his face reddened, his fists clenching, his voice breaking with fury. "You think you've won? You think you can embarrass me like this? You embarrassed yourself," I replied evenly. Evadne tried one last time, her tone desperate now. "You abandoned family. That's what this is. You walked away when we needed you most. I shook my head slowly, my words quiet but unflinching. Family abandoned me long before I walked out. The sentence landed with finality. Osric flinched. Corvin's anger boiled into incoherent muttering. Evadne's face crumpled, not in regret, but in the sting of having no defense left. For the first time, I felt the balance shift. Not loudly, not with triumph, but with empowerment so steady it seemed to hum in my bones. The shouting must have carried farther than I realized, because soon there were murmurs outside the door. I caught glimpses of neighbors peeking in, some of the party guests from the night before lingering curiously. Their whispers grew into a ripple that filled the hall. "Didn't she pay for everything?" someone whispered. "So the brother just took over?" another asked. Corvin's face turned crimson as he realized the audience had returned. His carefully built facade was collapsing in front of witnesses who had once applauded him. Osric, usually the pillar, suddenly looked smaller, diminished in his own stance. He adjusted his coat nervously, his eyes darting to the floor. Evadne's hand shook as she clutched her purse. They wanted the world to see my erasure, I thought. Instead, the world saw their emptiness. The humiliation they had reserved for me had reversed, spilling onto them in full view of the very people they had hoped to impress. And this time, the silence of those watching wasn't indifference, it was judgment. I took one last look at the bare room, its emptiness almost beautiful now. It wasn't a loss, it was a liberation. I stepped toward Osric, pressed the set of keys into his palm, and let them drop. The clink of metal against skin sounded louder than all the shouting that had come before. "An empty room," I said softly, "has more honesty than a house full of liars." I turned without another glance, their voices cracking behind me, tangled in desperation and anger. But none of it reached me. Because with every step out of that apartment, I was leaving behind not just the space, but the lies that had tried to bury me. And as the hallway swallowed their chaos, I stepped into silence that belonged only to me. The first few mornings in my smaller apartment were unnervingly quiet. No heavy footsteps pacing the hallway, no laughter meant to humiliate me, no voices pressing me into a corner. I would wake up, put on a pot of coffee, and sit at the small table by the window, letting the silence fill me. But it wasn't empty. That silence carried weight. I could still hear the metallic clink of the keys dropping into my father's palm, the sound of finality, louder than any shouting match we had ever had. That moment replayed in my mind, not as defeat, but as victory. I told myself, sometimes the loudest thing you can do is walk away. I remembered a quote I once saw framed in a waiting room at the hospital. "Silence is sometimes the most powerful scream." I understood it now. My calm, the deliberate act of walking out, had shaken them far more than any words. In their abandoned apartment, they had chaos, bare walls, echoes of their own cruelty, the taste of humiliation. In mine, I had peace. I sat there, the morning light slanting across the reclaimed furniture I had taken with me, and thought, my calm was their storm. It didn't take long for word to spread. Cleveland wasn't a small town, but gossip traveled faster than cars on the freeway. Neighbors who had attended Corvin's party told others how the night ended. People who once excused my brother's failures whispered about him now with pity or disgust. Corvin called me, his voice tight, almost breaking. "You ruined everything," he yelled before I even said hello. I held the phone steady. "No, Corvin, you ruined yourself. I just stopped carrying your comfort." "You embarrassed me in front of everyone," he snapped. "Do you know what it's like to have people looking at you like you're pathetic?" "Yes," I said evenly. "I do. You and our parents made sure I felt that way for years." The silence on the other end stretched. For the first time, he tasted the sting of public shame. For the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking under it. His voice cracked as he muttered, "You'll regret this," before hanging up. But the words sounded hollow, desperate, like a boy threatening a storm he could no longer summon. A day later, it was my parents' turn. Evadne's voice came sharp on the line, followed by Osric's steady rumble. Family sticks together, she began, her tone laced with anger disguised as disappointment. You've embarrassed us, Thalassa. Everyone's talking. Do you know what that feels like? Yes, I said calmly. I know exactly what it feels like. Osric cut in, low and commanding. You've gone too far. This isn't about right or wrong. It's about loyalty. You don't shame your own blood in front of outsiders. I laughed softly, not cruel, just tired. Family doesn't erase family. You taught me that the hard way. I didn't shame you. You shamed yourselves when you chose him over me again and again. They tried to minimize it. Evadne said, it was just a misunderstanding. People always twist stories. But I knew, and they knew, that the truth had already taken root. Rumors and witnesses carried the weight they could never erase. It wasn't me on trial anymore. It was them, their favoritism, their lies, their cruelty. And though vindication felt sharp, it was also sad. Sad that this was what family had become. A week later, I sealed an envelope. Inside was the final check, signed in my neat handwriting. Along with it, I slipped a note written on plain paper. This is the last rent check you'll ever cash in my name. I mailed it and pictured Evadne opening the envelope, her eyes skimming the words, Osric standing behind her, his face falling. The image wasn't gloating, it was justice. I thought, I gave them what they wanted, freedom from me. But freedom has a cost. When you strip someone down to nothing, you don't get to keep the version of them that carried you. You get silence. And silence is expensive. That evening, I stood in my new apartment, surrounded by the furniture I had reclaimed. The table I had assembled until my hands blistered, the rug that warmed my feet after long shifts, the lamps that glowed softly at night. Each piece carried a history, proof that I had built something real, something they could no longer touch. I ran my fingers over the edge of the table and smiled faintly. They thought they had trapped me. Instead, they handed me the key to walk away. I turned slowly, taking in the sight of my new home. It wasn't grand, it wasn't large, but it was mine. And as I looked around, I realized the true eviction wasn't mine. It was theirs. The first weeks in my new apartment passed with a rhythm that felt unfamiliar, but good. Each morning, I would wake to sunlight spilling gently across the floorboards, cutting through the quiet in a way that felt like a blessing. The smell of coffee brewing in my small kitchen became a daily comfort, richer than it had ever been when I lived under my parents' shadow. The space was smaller, yes, the furniture mostly secondhand, but every item answered only to me. I would sit at the reclaimed table, my table, the one I had assembled with blistered hands years ago, and run my fingers across its grain. It was scratched, worn, imperfect, but it was mine. That table became my anchor of renewal, the center around which I rebuilt my life. For the first time, I wasn't living in someone else's story. For the first time, every corner, every wall, every small detail spoke of me alone. And in that silence, I found a kind of peace I had never known. Meanwhile, the city carried whispers of what had happened. Stories traveled fast, even without my voice pushing them along. I didn't need to say a word. Neighbors, co-workers, even distant acquaintances carried fragments of the truth. Didn't she pay for everything in that place? I overheard one neighbor murmur at the grocery store. Another voice, half shocked, half satisfied, replied, I heard he threw a party and ended up humiliated. Lost all his furniture, too. I walked past them, head high, cart rattling over the tiled floor. They didn't know I was there, but their words carried a strange vindication. Corvin's reputation shrank, his inflated ego punctured by whispers he couldn't control. My parents' image bruised as people turned their heads when they entered a room. Justice hadn't come in a courtroom, but it was real. Justice came in silence, in the way people's eyes shifted, the way conversations stopped when they walked by. I remembered something John Wooden once said, reputation is what people think you are, character is what you really are. My parents had spent years polishing Corvin's reputation, but in the end, character revealed itself, and it wasn't mine that collapsed. Still, the satisfaction was bittersweet. I hadn't wanted victory this way, but I had to accept it as it was, the truth finally unveiled. In the quiet of my evenings, I thought about family, not with longing, but with clarity. I admitted to myself that I no longer expected apologies. They weren't coming, and I didn't need them anymore. For too long, I had clung to the cultural script that family always comes first, that blood binds stronger than anything else. But I had learned the harder truth. When family becomes toxic, clinging to that script can destroy you. I remembered Evadne's voice, sharp with judgment. Family sacrifices for family. Now I thought, sacrifice without respect is just servitude. The words echoed through me with a calm I hadn't felt before. My sacrifice had been demanded, not honored. And when sacrifice becomes a tool of control, it ceases to be love. I let that truth settle like a stone in still water, rippling outward until my whole being accepted it. But liberation wasn't only about what I had lost, it was also about what I was building. Yes, I grieved the bond I had once believed in. There were nights when the absence of their voices pressed heavy on me, when I mourned not what was, but what could never be. Yet I also recognized the growth. I was no longer invisible, I told myself, staring into the mirror one morning before work. Even if only to myself, I finally existed. I began to build a new support system. A neighbor helped me carry groceries up the stairs one evening, and we shared a laugh that led to coffee the next morning. A coworker dropped by after a shift with a bottle of wine, and we sat late into the night swapping stories about resilience. It wasn't family by blood, but it was family by choice. I thought, sometimes family isn't the one you're born into. It's the one you build around honesty. And I remembered a line by C.S. Lewis. You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. That became my mantra. I couldn't rewrite the years of erasure, but I could author what came next. One evening, I sat at my table, a new journal in front of me. My hand hesitated for a moment over the first page. The last time I had kept one, it had been violated, turned into a weapon against me, but I pressed pen to paper anyway. I let them go, I wrote, the ink flowing steady. And in letting go, I found myself. I leaned back, staring at the words. The past wasn't gone. The scars still existed, but they no longer owned me. I closed the journal slowly, the sound of its cover snapping shut, filling the room like a promise. And as I set it aside, I thought, the story wasn't over. Just theirs was. In the month that followed, silence became my companion, but not the empty kind. It was the sort of silence that hummed with justice. While I settled into my new life, my absence became a storm for them. I heard it in whispers at the grocery store, caught glances at the post office, overheard fragments while waiting in line for gas. Corvin's disastrous party had turned into a neighborhood tale, retold with relish. Didn't she strip the place bare? One woman said behind me in line. Good for her, another replied. She paid for all of it. About time someone stood up to them. Meanwhile, the rent they had doubled became their noose. Without my steady checks, their finances faltered. Bills piled high, the mortgage on their other property suddenly too heavy. I imagined Evadne at her kitchen table, calculator in hand, trying to balance a sheet that no longer worked. They demanded I disappear, I thought. Instead, they vanished piece by piece. Respect, comfort, pride. I remembered an old African proverb I'd once read. The axe forgets, the tree remembers. And in this case, I was the tree. Every swing they had taken at me, I remembered. And now, they were left splintered. Corvin tried to bluff his way through the wreckage. For a time, he strutted around, insisting he was still on top. But illusion crumbles when no one believes it anymore. Friends began avoiding him, weary of his arrogance. Job interviews ended quickly once his reputation preceded him. The call came late one night. His voice no longer angry, but desperate. I just need a little help, he said, words strained. I let the silence stretch before answering. Help is earned, Corvin, not stolen. His breathing was heavy on the other end. You don't get it. I'm your brother. You're supposed to back me up. My voice was calm. For the first time, I'm not the one begging. You are. And no, I won't carry you anymore. I hung up, my chest steady. Vindication washed over me, not cruel, not triumphant, but clean. Then came my parents. Their call was sharper, laced with anger, wrapped in shame. "Family sticks together," Evadne scolded. "You've embarrassed us. Everyone knows what you did. Do you realize how that feels?" "Yes," I said, my tone even. "I know exactly how that feels." Osric's voice was gravel, meant to intimidate. "You went too far. You humiliated us in front of the whole community. This wasn't just about a house. This was about loyalty." I let out a short laugh. "Family doesn't erase family. You erased me long before I walked away." They shifted tactics, tried guilt. "You left us with nothing," my mother whispered. I closed my eyes and answered slowly, clearly. "No. I left you with exactly what you gave me." The words landed like stone, and I could hear the air change. Neighbors must have overheard through thin walls or open windows, because soon enough, the whispers turned sharper in town. Old allies who once defended them no longer spoke up. Invitations dried, smiles disappeared. Justice came, not with handcuffs, but with eyes turned away. And I thought of another saying, one I'd heard often: "You reap what you sow." Weeks later, I stood in front of my neighbors at a small gathering. It wasn't a courtroom, but it might as well have been. People had questions. They wanted clarity. So I gave it, calmly, without anger. I laid it all out. How I had paid every month. How I had repaired every pipe, bought every stick of furniture, covered every tax. How my parents doubled the rent to force me out. How Corvin paraded through my home like a conqueror, only to be left with empty walls. I spoke not for sympathy, but for truth. They wanted applause for their lies, I said to the circle of faces watching me. I gave them truth instead. And the silence after was louder than any cheer. Heads nodded. Some looked down, ashamed they had believed the other version. Others met my eyes, their respect quiet but strong. That night, Corvin and my parents' image crumbled completely. Their power had been built on performance, but without an audience, the act was worthless. One morning, not long after, sunlight streamed through the window of my new apartment, landing on the rug I had taken with me. I stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by furniture I had chosen, items that carried the weight of my work, my independence. I sat at my table, opened my journal, and wrote my final reflection. They evicted me from their love, so I evicted them from my life. I laid down the pen and leaned back. The eviction they planned wasn't mine, it was theirs, from my future, from my story. I closed the journal with a soft thud, smiling faintly. Because some doors should never open again.